That a mid-17th century poet like Marvell should have a corpus of Latin poetry, some 20 pieces, between 5 and 10% of his known poetic output, is no surprise. Exercises in translation from Latin to English and back again into Latin will have been part of Marvell's own school days and also part of his later work as a tutor. Moreover, another of Marvell's day jobs was a period of government service in the 1650s as assistant to the Secretary for Foreign Tongues in the Commonwealth of England, commonly known as the Latin Secretary, a job in which his immediate supervisor was none other than John Milton. So it's relevant to note that when Milton published the first definitive collection of his poems in 1645, it was a double book containing a vernacular volume of English poems, plus a handful in Italian, followed by a volume of Latin poemata, plus a couple in Greek, with many thematic links across the two volumes. What we can't talk about in Marvell's case is a dialogue between poetic languages at the level of the book, for the simple reason that most of Marvell's verse remains unpublished until after his death. But we can talk about instances of paired English and Latin poems in Marvell, which were clearly conceived together and meant to be read together. And sometimes, at least, when Marvell translates Latin into English and English into Latin, his exploration of issues of verbal literalism and verbal transformation seems to be a way of negotiating the things which are most Marvellian in Marvell, his movements towards the transcendental. On the screen here, I've set out the opening and closing lines of On a Drop of Dew, one of Marvell's best-known poems, and of Rose, the much less well-known Latin version of the same, which stands right after it in the posthumously collected poems of 1681. All I'll say about them today is that, first, the theme of the twin poems constitutes a programmatic distillation of Marvell's interest in transcendence. Drop of dew comes down from heaven to earth, but aspires to return to heaven. And second, that the multiple word plays between English and Latin in the two poems show how an interest in transformation and transcendence can be negotiated through acts of translation. This is a textbook example of how Marvell uses Latin to think with. In the poem's opening and closing movements from heaven to earth and from earth back to heaven, the Latin poems provide the armature and almost close the gaps between the opposing terms. Dew is to rose, as ros is to rosa. Earth is to sun, as solum is to soul. Finally, this time implicitly, the drop of dew returns to the sun as the twice-repeated stilla morphs into a stella. A pun spotted, how could it not be, by Estelle Hahn, the ranking authority in Marvell's and Milton's Latin poetry. In this sense, then, the Latin poem drives the agenda of the English twin. But in a larger sense, although I'm not going to go into this here, there are moments when the English poem seems to seize the initiative from the Latin one, with pieces of conventional and classically Roman imagery in the Latin version transformed in the English version into something newer, more distinctive, and, well, more Marvellian.